But I'm also fascinated by the interpersonal relationships and the interpersonal dynamic when there is some sort of conflict. But the idea about neurodiversity, like bringing that to the fold, there are a lot of folks who are in the conflict space, whether it's a mediator or a lawyer or judges, and whether it's a police officer or somebody conducting an investigation. They think a lot about trying to read people, right? And trying to understand and make inferences about somebody's demeanor and their behavior. That is fascinating to me because it is so fraught with risk in this particular space, particularly with neurodiversity.
Hello, welcome back to the NITW Podcast, where we talk about and unpack and try to learn as much as possible about all things neurodiversity in the workplace. And so for today's episode, I am joined by Laura Anthony of In Compliance. And yeah, Laura, I'll turn it over to you to kind of introduce who you are, what you do, and meet our audience.
All right, thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm a lawyer, disability lawyer, but I also am a consultant. I work with companies, communities, education institutions on having a more neuro-inclusive workforce, which, you guys do as well. Mm-hmm. And so being more neuro-inclusive is about systems and processes and language and being welcoming and being affirming. But some of the things that I do relate to some of my roles as a consultant. And some of those roles include conducting investigations. I also conduct mediations, and I also do hearings as an external third party. And so my neuro-inclusive framework and focus are sometimes on those topics.
Okay, yeah, excellent. And so in the broad field of law, I'm curious, kind of the origin story, as you were telling me earlier, if you can enlighten us on just kind of what bridged you from law to tying in disability and neurodiversity in particular.
Yeah, so when I thought about what am I going to do in terms of using my law degree, I was really pushed and kind of informed by my experience growing up with a parent who survived a traumatic brain injury. So when I was in elementary school, my mom had a TBI, traumatic brain injury. She became disabled from that. She had some cognitive impairments, she had some motor skill impairments, she had impairments of her executive functioning skills, fine motor, and language. And so when I was in elementary school, I kind of lived the life of navigating neurodiversity. And it was from that experience that I kind of learned the lesson of our world really isn't built for people whose brains work in ways that we don't expect. And so from that, I kind of gravitated into studying psychology. I've really been fascinated by brain science, and all of the legal steps that I've taken really sit at the intersection of law and human behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's really a comfort zone for me. It's a fascination zone for me, and it's really something that I've pursued in all of my professional roles. So as a disability attorney, I've worked with schools, I've worked with communities, higher ed institutions on assisting individuals with disabilities, because that's honestly what I've been doing even before the word neurodiversity was a buzzword. Right. And so that has felt really natural to me. And as I've worked as an investigator and as a hearing officer and as a mediator, oftentimes the work that I do involves individuals whose brains work a little bit differently, and they communicate in ways we don't expect, and they process information in ways we don't expect. And so it's been a very natural and really rewarding experience.
Great. And I find it interesting, where you sit navigating the balance, as you said, between law and human behavior, which feel like inherently conflicting things, in that one is so, rigid and kind of black and white, and the other is human behavior. I can only imagine, especially with the variety of neurodiversity thrown into the mix, is incredibly unpredictable, incredibly variable, individualistic. And one, I'm curious, does that pose a challenge to you in your work of, kind of mediating, apart from individual to individual, mediating law and human behavior as they're so different, as well as kind of, just kind of finding ways to apply that. You mentioned some of the places where you practice your expertise, but maybe you can illuminate just how that impacts those different environments. You mentioned, education, employment, et cetera.
Right. It's interesting that you call it a challenge. I actually feel it was a really great opportunity.
Okay.
So I just remember studying psychology. My background is in social psychology. And when I went into law school, I almost took it as a big social psych experiment.
Okay.
The rigor of it, the Socratic method, the study, the fatigue, all of those things. And I think that my background and my studies helped me navigate that. I'm also somebody who is not, I don't love conflict, but I'm somewhat drawn to it. I think that's one of the reasons I became a lawyer. But I'm also fascinated by the interpersonal relationships and the interpersonal dynamic when there is some sort of conflict. But the idea about neurodiversity, like bringing that to the fold, there are a lot of folks who are in the conflict space, whether it's a mediator or a lawyer or judges, and whether it's a police officer or somebody conducting an investigation. They think a lot about trying to read people, right? And trying to understand and make inferences about somebody's demeanor and their behavior. That is fascinating to me because it is so fraught with risk in this particular space, particularly with neurodiversity and individuals who process different ways and express their challenges and their frustrations and their sensitivities in different ways. And so I think that has been a fascinating thing to take a step back. And so in education, certainly you've got teachers who are reading behavior in the classroom. They're making judgments about a behavior. And some of them are doing great things. And and I do a lot of special education work. And so in that context, you're examining the causes of somebody's behavior, the triggers for that behavior, the we call it antecedents and consequences of that behavior. And then they go to college, right? And then the students are having to advocate for themselves and navigate tricky situations. Something happens in the residence hall. Something happens with a miscue about maybe consent, right? There's different things that happen. And then they go into the workplace. And so that has been my focus of thinking about the lessons that I learned as a special ed lawyer, those things that I carry over when I'm working with colleges and universities, and how to help businesses and communities become more inclusive to individuals who process and communicate in different ways.
Yeah, I appreciate that kind of overview and explanation, because I feel like in a minute and a half you switched me from saying, where do these things intersect, to where don't they interplay, in day to day. I mean, I feel like with that mindset, every day of your life, every place you go, every experience you have can kind of function as a social experiment. As you mentioned your college experience was kind of like that, and I can imagine, navigating that whole world, I'm sure, is a challenge to a lot of people. But so you kind of pick up the experience and kind of your professional life weighs in when those intersections happen in the workplace, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so your role, if I'm correct, is in investigative interviews as well. And so, I think I and probably our listeners would benefit from maybe an explainer, an introduction to that. One, like, what does that mean? Two, what is your role in it? Three, you kind of teased at this before, but like the nuances of neurodiversity, how might that impact the investigation process?
Well, I'll take the first question first.
Great. Yeah. Sorry, I tend to throw multiples at a time.
That's okay. And in an inclusive interview situation, I'm going to take them one by one.
Perfect.
So how does an investigative interview differ from a regular interview? Somebody might be interviewing for a job. Well, there's a couple of different things you have to think about. An investigative interview is done. Well, let's take it one step backwards. Many organizations, many institutions have internal investigative processes. So somebody files a complaint, whether it's at a school or whether it's at a business, and that complaint a lot of times has to do with your coworkers, or it has to do with a compliance issue. So the stakes are a little bit higher in an investigative interview than a job interview. Job interview, you volunteered for it, right? You've prepared for it. You're coming into the interview situation. You're thinking about, I want to get this job. So you have a goal. In an investigative interview, you're usually not volunteering for this.
You ended up there.
You ended up there. You're either a party or you're a witness. And it's high stakes. So somebody, let's say it might be a discrimination complaint or a complaint about some other type of misconduct, or it's a licensure issue. Somebody did something contrary to a standard, or maybe it's something that might have some law enforcement implications or some risk or liability to the institution. And so for that type of interview, there's a lot of stake there. There's a lot of potential angst, there's a lot of potential outcomes that might be negative. And then after the interview's over, you're probably going back to be around your coworkers. And so it's not as if you're going into the interview, you go home, you kind of decompress. You might just go back to your desk.
Yeah, there's a whole life post-interview that is its own challenge to navigate.
And maybe everybody knows that this investigation is going on, and there's just a lot of things that are swirling around. So that's the context of it that is different than a employment interview. The goal is also different. So when I'm an investigator, and I'll talk about my role, because that was, I think, the third question. When you're an investigator, your goal is to get as much information as possible so that you can figure out, like, what happened, maybe get to the bottom of discrepancies in people's perspectives of what happened, and then determine potentially what happens next. So your goal is to, I always call myself, when I'm in an interview situation as an investigator, I'm a hunter and gatherer of facts. I'm just like trying to do as much as I can to make people at ease so that they give me information.
I feel like that part gets overlooked.
Absolutely.
Of like the environment you create, the social atmosphere, so that then you can get to the actual point, which is truth, fact, explanation, understanding.
Right. And for lawyers, I'm going to just call out my profession a little bit. Sometimes when you're asking questions, I'm going to be cross-examining them. I'm going to be in a deposition mode. I'm trying to catch them in something. And that is just one way to shut it down really quickly. And so as an investigative interview, I am trying to, as you mentioned, create an environment where I'm going to get as much information so I can distill the facts, the credibility of the people, of the statements that are being made, and then figure out what happens next. So the goal is very different in an investigative interview. And then finally, when you think about the interviewee, you have to have it open so that you don't know if the person that you're interviewing processes information differently.
Right, that's not usually a prerequisite question.
No, absolutely not. So thinking about those universal designs within that context is really critical, because you want to make sure that it's not the process that is creating obstacles for that information gathering process, but and do what you can to lessen all of that angst that I mentioned, which is just swirling around from those interview situations.
Right. Okay, cool. So, and then I think my third question was, and you've kind of dipped into this a little bit with, creating the environment, considering processing styles, but maybe I'm sure that there's more layers to how neurodivergence, whether known or unknown in who you're interviewing, which is its own kind of complicated factor, but neurodivergence in general, where does that create potential barriers, pitfalls, or opportunities when investigating?
Absolutely. So there are a couple things when you think about hunting and gathering of those facts. You are relying on people's memory, their ability to store information, give it back to you, and their communication skills. And so those two things can be impacted, as your listeners know, as you know, can be impacted by neurodiversity. So when we're taking information in, you are storing that information, and then you have to retrieve it based on whatever prompt you're given. So whether it's tell me what happened, or yesterday, I understand yesterday something happened. Let's create a scenario. Maybe I can use that as an example. Let's say you are in a workplace, and a common situation is somebody ate my lunch out of the refrigerator, right? I brought my favorite dish. It's in the refrigerator.
We need to get to the bottom of
this. Right. I'm going to file a complaint because my grandma's favorite lasagna is now missing, and that's what I was going to have. And so you can ask the question, what happened yesterday? Or you can ask the question, I'm here to ask you about what happened in the lunchroom, the missing lunch, and you can be more targeted and direct, because what you're asking the person to do is provide you with relevant information about the missing lunch. So we talked about memory, and we talked about communication, and there are certain strategies, which we can get to, but to help individuals who may have difficulty or differences in retrieving information, or they may have differences in communicating that information. So those are two things. The other thing with neurodiversity and investigative interviews is that we mentioned earlier, I'm hunting and gathering facts, and then I'm going to determine what statements to believe. So now, in addition to gathering the information, I'm going to make a credibility determination. And for individuals who are neurodivergent, that creates some sticky situations because there's been some studies that, people think they can tell when somebody's lying, right? And one of the primary two of the primary areas where people think that demonstrates lack of credibility is eye contact and body movements, fidgeting. Now, what do we know about individuals who are neurodivergent?
That's red flag areas.
That's absolutely red flag areas. So when somebody's not making eye contact, or they're doing some sort of repetitive movement, maybe they're stimming, maybe they're doing something that is comforting to them in the moment, that may be an indicator of not of their deception, but that may be an indicator of their discomfort. And so using demeanor for credibility determinations becomes very tricky. And so how I train investigators, and whether I'm training a global brand or I'm training a local school, to helping them understand that those assumptions that they have about demeanor, they're strongly held assumptions, but oftentimes they're wrong. So strong but wrong. Like, those are the things that I try to train people to take those assumptions out of the process.
That's incredibly hard to unlearn, as we have kind of learned and experienced with, as you contrasted job interviewers, whether they're told to or not, are so conditioned to evaluate those same things. And whether it's instructed to the interviewee in either context or not, it's usually something that they can't unlearn if your nature is to not make eye contact or to communicate in a less than mainstream way. It's not something that people can just flip the switch and not do because, I might get flagged by this interviewer. It makes me really glad that you are in a role of training so that your knowledge of this intersection and potential pitfalls is not siloed within your brain, but being hopefully shared and retained and acted upon by many other interviewers. Because this is definitely a dangerous area if folks were to be commonly misread in that way.
One of the analogies that I use just to kind of highlight that point is, when most everybody's probably been to a funeral, right? You go to a funeral, you're there because you are grieving somebody or you're honoring the memory of somebody. But we all know that when we go to the funeral, somebody might be laughing, and somebody might be crying, and somebody might be isolating in the corner, and somebody might be hugging everybody. But we accept the fact that they are there because they're honoring that particular individual, and how they're expressing their grief, that divergence in grief. We don't say that that's wrong. We say that everybody's showing up for the particular purpose of honoring that person. And so, when we talk about neurodivergence, it's not divergence in grieving, but it's divergence in thinking and communicating and showing engagement. And so when you're in a job interview and somebody's not making eye contact or they're fidgety, they're there to show up. You're honoring the fact that they're there for that purpose. And so I feel like there are so many other areas that we can accept that people express different things in different ways, and we just kind of have to build that bridge.
Yeah, no, those examples, we're always hunting for effective examples of, what are the subconscious judgments and barriers that come into play. And I think examples like you just shared of like, what does it look like to not submit to those subconscious biases? And that's a really great example. I also liked what you shared earlier about, when asking a question, being as strategic and specific as possible, not to catch somebody, but to just assess fact and truth. One of the most common messages we give in our consulting and our training to managers is, and in interviews, is ask questions and give information as clearly, specifically, and concretely as possible. And, there's our library of what that looks like can never be big enough. because that sounds simple, but then when somebody just takes that concept, they return to their day and communicate the exact same way while thinking, oh, I should be clear and concrete. And then you say, hey, like prepare a report for the meeting.
Right.
With no specifics. So the specifics that you gave as to, if you want to find out about, what happened at lunch or what happened yesterday, right, that lacks any and all specificity and will not yield the result that the investigator is looking for at all.
Well, in the investigation world, there are some concrete procedures
Right.
that most investigators are taught to do that don't jive really well with this concept.
Wow.
So most training, a lot of training, I haven't been to most, so I guess I'll just say a lot of training when you're thinking about becoming an investigator. They teach you, start with open-ended questions, have a funnel approach,
Wow.
allow somebody to give their narrative, and then, don't break their flow. You just start, taking notes. What happened? Boom, boom, boom. You're writing it all down. And then later on, you follow up with specific targeted questions. There are actually some studies of students with autism about their ability to report specific details about a situation, looking at students with autism and students who don't have an autism diagnosis. And the level of detail is very dependent on how you ask the questions. An open-ended free recall response does not elicit the kind of details you would otherwise get if you ask those specific targeted questions. And yet, investigators are typically trained to
Right.
be very open-ended. And so for a neuroinclusive investigation process, you just need to make sure that this is not working.
Yeah.
Because if I ask the question of what happened yesterday, and I'm investigating the missing lasagna, right? And I asked you what happened yesterday. You might start off with what did you have for breakfast and how late you were to catch the train, or what happened next. Versus when I ask a very specific targeted question, I might get more detail about lunch and who was in the lunchroom when you discovered that it was missing, and did you find some lasagna, residue in the microwave, or whatever those relevant details were. It's just thinking about unlearning. I mean, we talked about unlearning those assumptions, but also unlearning some of the procedural things that investigators are taught to do.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking about this, and it's interesting to me because I can see the logic of the funnel approach, start wide, open to whatever information they can share, but that does kind of assume one communication style.
Right.
It assumes that everyone will kind of interpret the question and share their stories in approximately the same way, which obviously is not going to be true. So then you mentioned earlier the challenge of not knowing when you begin an interview one's communication style.
Right.
And so you have to lean on whatever universal processes or adaptations are as universal as possible. What's your thought process on that? Like, when do you maybe get a sense of somebody's communication style, and do you make any pivots based on that, or do you just kind of universally try to universal design your way through every interaction? What's the thought process there?
So for me, I do a layered approach. So in any initial outreach, so remember, I am somebody who comes into a corporation or a community or an institution. I am not part of I'm an external third-party investigator. I don't know people, right? And so that actually gives me some good opportunities to be able to say, hey, we've never met before. It would be helpful for me to know, like, how you might feel most comfortable in this particular situation. Because an investigation is stressful, it's hard, it can create a whole bunch of emotion and concerns about retaliation and concerns about what happens next. And so I acknowledge that this is going to be stressful, so I'm going to ask. I want to make it the most inclusive process. So if you need any type of support, if there are certain things that when we get into it that you're starting to feel like you might need some support, you can tell me, and you can tell me what you might need in the moment. Another thing that investigators are taught is to establish rapport. So maybe you're talking about not what happened in the lunchroom, but like, what do you do in your job, and how long have you worked here? Somebody who's neurodiverse might be like, I'm here to talk about the lasagna, and you're asking me questions about how long I've been with this company, and
Yeah.
I'm kind of irritated by that because I'm here for this. So instead of establishing rapport by talking about things external to, like, the lasagna, thief, I'm going to ask questions about, what do you need to feel comfortable in this particular situation? What might I see in you that would tell me that we might need to pivot? So I'm establishing rapport about the person and about the interview situation versus...
But you're also doing that more directly.
Absolutely.
Which is kind of,
yeah.
That's a
But for
red
everyone.
thread through all of what we're talking about, is like just being more direct, of saying like, yeah, what would make you more comfortable? Maybe even asking like, I don't know, if you get into communication style specifics or environmental specifics. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going to try to be direct in my communication style. I'm going to employ some techniques that might help get information out of people's memory. We can talk about that. And then I'm going to think about environmental. So I'm going to think about what's my lighting? Did I just have, thinking about the lasagna caper, but did I just have Indian takeout and I'm in the room where something is, you can smell the Indian takeout, or I am in a room with fluorescent lights and the humming. And so I'm going to look at the environment just to make sure from a sensory perspective, the person isn't distracted by all of those different things, and then they can focus more on the exchange, which by its nature is going to be difficult.
Yeah.
So trying to keep those things down a little bit, those triggers, those sensory distractions, helps with the communication.
Okay, great.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of our conversation with Laura Anthony. Join us again for part 2 in 2 weeks.